In today's episode of the Hart Hustle podcast, we sit across the table from Kevin Ervin, the CEO of Our Turn. Now, today's episode is going to be very impactful because we're going to listen to how Kevin's journey informed him with an opportunity to be able to double down, to be able to serve his community in ways that he could never imagine. We're going to hear about a tragedy that happened outside of his childhood bedroom window. We're going to talk about how he looked to build community, to be able to unite people in the Bronx and in Brooklyn. We're going to hear about the thousands of lives who he's impacted and what's next for Kevin in this episode. Let's get into it.
So I knew the bodega owners by name. I knew the parents in the streets by name. I knew the man that stood on the corner by name, the construction workers. All of them knew me, and I knew them. And they would actually call me Mr. Vacamus. I worked for an organization called Vacamus. And they'd be like, oh, there's Mr. Vacamus coming. And when kids didn't show up to school, I was just going and knocking on their door. And oftentimes, schools do reactive work for attendance, right? It's like, oh, you missed school today, so we'll call you at the end of the day. I was monitoring, I had a caseload of about 100 students. I was monitoring them by the hour. If you weren't in school by 9 a.m., school started at 8 a.m., I was going to your house. I was knocking on your door and I was all right, come on, take a shower, get dressed. I'll stand here, I'll wait.
So Kevin, when we met previously, you had mentioned something that was incredibly powerful and impactful, and something that my mom said to me every single day. What did your mom say to you every single day when you and your, siblings would leave the house?
Every day, on our way to school or wherever we were going, my mom would pray with my siblings and me, and then just say, be a leader, not a follower. And she would tell us that every problem has an answer. It's like a puzzle piece. You just need to find the right pieces. And that has really resonated with me throughout my entire life and my career.
Something that I'm really excited about is to talk about your educational experience and how it puts you on a little bit of a different path to be able to be a leader and an impactor at an incredibly young age. You said that in the first grade, you had a tragic event happen outside of your bedroom window. Would you mind sharing that?
Yeah, so I attended what's now known as the Patrick F. Daly School. But when I attended, it was just Public School 15. And the principal there was Patrick F. Daly. And when I was in the first grade, he was pursuing a student who ran outside of the school, just being the good human being that he was and that I remember him as. And he got caught in the crossfire of sort of like a gang war that was happening and was shot and killed right outside of my childhood bedroom window. And I remember not really understanding what was happening and my mom picking up my brother and me really early and going home and seeing all the police outside of my home. And later it was revealed to me that occurred. And as a result of that, my entire school community wrapped its arms around peace. We got a new school song. We got a new mantra, and the sixth graders were being trained in mediation at that point. And as a first grader, I was watching the mediators be trained and sort of thought to myself, this is kind of odd because there are problems across all the grades. And sure, the sixth graders could help out the fifth graders or fourth graders, but who was on the ground with us in the first grade? And I asked if I could be a mediator, and they said no, it was exclusive for the sixth graders. And I sort of said, nah, I don't think so. I think we could do this for us as well, maybe on a smaller level. And because of that, they helped me to create the junior mediators at our school, who were first graders who did what the sixth graders did, just on a smaller level.
Kevin, how does a first grader have that sense of awareness about his environment to be able to go to leadership at the school and say, hey, I want to be a mediator too? And they're looking at you as a little first grader and saying, hey, man, this is reserved for sixth graders. How was that reception? Like, what was that like?
I think a lot of my confidence comes from that sort of same be a leader, not a follower bit. And my mom always sharing with me that aside from money and wealth and all of those things and things that one could gain and guns and bullets and things growing up in the project, she told me that the most powerful weapon was a human being with knowledge. And she said that your voice matters and that you could go out and ask and advocate for yourself. And sometimes that backfired on her in our home when I would advocate for myself. But out in the public world, she always told me, like, speak your mind, say what you think. And if people don't accept you, even the Bible says, brush the dust from your feet, where people don't accept you. And she take that same mantra. So approaching that as a first grader, I just thought and still believe that humans are humans, right? Whether you are 6 years old or 60 years old, you deserve respect. You require respect. You need respect, love, and care. And that's what I gave out, and that's what I expected back. So it wasn't a really harrowing task for me. I didn't get afraid of human beings until I became an adult, actually.
It's an interesting revelation. One of the things that we talked about in our previous conversation was your experience going through school, which was the exact opposite of mine. You said you fell in love with education. You really enjoyed going to school quite early, but you also had a little bit of a pivot where you went to a charter school, right? And you experienced what it was like for the institution to invest into you. What was that like?
Yeah, so I started my education in public school. I went to public school for elementary school. I went to public school for middle school, and I actually went to boarding school for high school, not a charter school, which is a little bit different. It's a preparatory school, which my friends thought I was either being sent away for bad behavior to the military or I was going to Hogwarts, and neither was true. Neither was true, but my mom didn't even understand that there existed these like very exclusive institutions in our country and in the world that prepared students exclusively for college. And at that point, I realized that education wasn't about teaching us what to think, but education was in fact about teaching young people how to think, right? You go to public school and they're teaching you towards a test and sort of just saying, hey, here's what you need to think so you can tick the boxes here and pass these tests. Where at the Hotchkiss school, which is the boarding school I went to, they didn't teach us what to think. They said, here's all this information. We'll teach you how to think critically and you make up your own mind. You figure this out for yourself. Philosophy was a required course. Imagine a 14-year-old kid from the Red Hook Project in Brooklyn taking a philosophy course, right? Where I'm trying to prove the existence of God through Descartes' theories, right? I was like, this is mind-blowing and ridiculous and amazing all at the same time, but gave me the ability to advocate for myself and for others because I was no longer thinking towards a test. I was thinking towards the world critically.
In our previous conversation, we talked a little bit about how the education system has been constantly formed, shaped, and molded based on someone's perspective that is outside of the education system, aka never asking the students what they're looking for in their education. When you went to this boarding school and you were given the plethora and the platter of things that you could pursue, did it kind of just completely change the way that you looked at education in general?
Both that and one other experience. So whilst I was in the Hotchkiss school, my sort of nighttime career is being a musician. So I went to Hotchkiss and I was working on music and I finished all of the music classes that I could take within my first 2 years there. And at that point, typically most students, just finish their requisites and go on to do other things. I loved music so dearly that I asked Fabio Witkowski, who was the head of the music department, what else I could study. And he told me that I could take on independent study at that point and craft my own route in music. And I really love music production and composition. So he worked with me to craft 2 years of music studies where I was studying with some of the professors there on jazz composition and choral arrangements. And I studied with him music technology. And as a result of that, they built a studio for me at the school so that I could learn music technology. And that expanded out into a larger music building. But one of the other sort of pinnacle points in my Hotchkiss career, there's an organization called the Seed Foundation, which actually has basically free preparatory schools for young people of color in America. That was started while I was at Hotchkiss. And the people who started that were going around the boarding schools, asking students about their experiences and asking to be a part of the fabric of the creation of this. And I was asked to be on that committee from the Hotchkiss school. And I was blown away because I was like, wow, you guys are starting a school, trying to invent a school, and you're not asking any of the teachers or staff members here how this school should be formed. You're asking only students to be on this board, this committee, to create this school, which exists to this day and really helps out a lot of folks around the country. And that, I think, was the linchpin of change for me, where my opinion became valuable, regardless of age, in the education space.
I think that we all have early experiences in life where we are heard and seen for the first time. and it changes the way that we look at every other opportunity. I feel like there are so many people out there who have never actually had that validating experience, no matter how old you are, of being seen, validated, and heard. That had to change like the entire trajectory of how you viewed yourself.
Absolutely. I know that as a black male growing up in New York City in the projects, right, my story was also the story of so many of my other friends. And because code switching is a thing that is almost inherently taught to people of color when you step into other spaces. When I went to the Hotchkiss school, I was an excellent code switcher, right? I was immediately going to assimilate to that culture and not the other way around. And I met a group of friends from around the world. I had friends from Jamaica, from Houston, Texas, from, upstate New York, from Miami, etc. And when we got together, we all could be uniquely ourselves. And at some point, I remember sitting with my friends and them sort of saying, hey, you got this talent around R&B, hip hop music, and this school needs that. Right. So at some point during my Hotchkiss career, I think about my third year there, we took the school song, which is a very stiff, old preparatory school song, and remixed it and into a rap song, used the school song as the chorus, and even had our school headmaster, who was probably in his 60s or 70s at that point, rap a verse on the song. We recorded the verse, and it like still lives in the school archives now. And at that point, I felt really seen for who I am and what my talents are, what my gifts are, and what I can bring to the world. And throughout my career, it's been sort of this fluctuation between holding on to that and presenting myself fully and totally to the world. And then, also assimilating to this, like, do I need to code switch? I'll say here, a year into my relationship with my wife, she sat down with me and she said, I don't understand this thing that you do. And she grew up in the Bronx. And I was like, what thing? And she was like, I don't know. Like, we go into these like fundraising things or these galas or these rooms, and you're able to like talk about things that you never do. You don't play golf, and you're able to sit and talk with people about golf, or you don't watch sports as much as you are. And I didn't even realize it at that point that she had the luxury during her entire life of never having to code switch. She never had to code switch. And before that conversation, I actually thought I had a skill of code switching, where in fact she had the luxury of never having to do that. So now I try to show up, as my full self all the time.
Man, this is really hitting me hard today. When we get into different environments, right, we go through the process of having to code switch and become a different version of ourselves to assimilate, to be able to be seen and validated by these other people. And at some point in time, we almost get an internal conversation that happens, or something happens along the way where we say, if I show up as my true self, I can be more powerful. I've been through that experience. When I first started my business back in 2014, I used to go into these healthcare organizations, these hospitals, and wear suits and ties and everything like that. And the reason why I did that is because deep down inside, now that I have the perspective, I wasn't confident in myself enough to show up as I am. And so when I go sit across from a CEO of a hospital today, I will show up in a black t-shirt. I'll show up in one of my team hats. I'll show up in Jordans, because I'm so confident that I know what I'm doing, that if they don't see me for who I am and the value that I bring, that's on them, not me. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. I had that exact same experience. My first job ever, I'd come out of going to the Hotchkiss school. I wasn't able to go to college immediately. That's another story. We can talk about that later. And I was working in a school in the Bronx, and I loved wearing ties. This was a part of my fashion sense. So I'd show up to work in like a bow tie and Nike Dunks, right? Like, people in the community knew me as that human being. And then as I sort of rose on the job ladder, I started wearing more and more suits all the time, which I like a good suit, but I didn't want to wear it every day. And also I was working with young people. I didn't want them to see me as being stiff, but I had that incongruency. Like you said, I didn't have the confidence in myself to believe that people would be able to see the me as who I am if I was in my normal clothes. And I actually had proof of those experiences sometimes. I showed up at the Department of Education in the Bronx taking 150 students to sleepaway camp for a weekend trip. And I had a hoodie on, and I was going to get these bus passes. And I remember going there, and the lady at the front desk wouldn't recognize me. Like, she wouldn't say anything to me. And she actually was having a conversation in Spanish with one of her coworkers and asked her, like, who's this hoodlum standing at the front desk? Now, she didn't know. I'd been in the Bronx for 9 years at that point, so my Spanish was top notch.
Point.
Right?
Yep.
And so she says, like, who's this hoodlum at the front desk? So, I'm just waiting there patiently. And I get the passes, and I have to come back that Tuesday. And on Tuesday, I'm wearing a suit. And she speaks to me immediately. Hello, how are you? What do you need? And I share with her, hey, I'm the hoodlum who was here last week with the hoodie on. I'm wearing a suit now. And I don't think that that's responsible for you to talk to your own people. Because you're from the Bronx. You look like us. You talk like us, et cetera, et cetera. Let's build each other up instead of pulling each other down. And I remember for years, I was the guy that was telling my students, if you dress a certain way, you won't be pulled over by the cops. If you look a certain way, you won't be harassed. If you do this, if you do that. And then in my own neighborhood in Brooklyn, in Carroll Gardens, where I grew up, I remember being pulled over at 2:00 in the morning once, and I was wearing my normal dressed up clothes. I was coming from a gig that I'd played, and the police officer, and I was on the corner of my house, which has terrible parking. The police officer asked me what I was doing driving around at that time. And I was perplexed. I said, I'm looking for parking. I'm trying to go to sleep. And he said, there's no way you live in this neighborhood. There's no way you actually live here. And I was like, I've actually lived here my entire life. This is the neighborhood I live in and grew up in. And at that moment, something clicked for me that it was like, it's not my clothes. It's not, my swagger or what have you. They're just some people who are not going to be able to see beyond their own biases. And that shouldn't impact who I show up as.
Man, I'm really inspired by your story. And I think it's really important that we touch on some of the elements of, when you're getting ready to go to college, you had so many opportunities in front of you, but you got a bad hand and misfortune that caused you to double down and reinvest into the community. I want to talk a little bit about that if you're okay with that.
Definitely. So, like I said, I went to the Hotchkiss School. I had an amazing experience. I applied to 11 universities. I was accepted to 10 of them. All except NYU, which wrapped around and came a part of my story later on. I was accepted to Berklee College of Music, where I knew I was going to go. University of Miami, BC, Princeton, all the big names, USC. And then I wasn't able to go because I filled out the financial aid form, the FAFSA, incorrectly. Most of the students at the Hotchkiss School come from really wealthy backgrounds. So these folks were not filling out financial aid forms at all. And Hotchkiss basically filled out the financial aid form for you when you were at their school, the form for their school. So I was on a full ride scholarship to go to the Hotchkiss School. So, what was sort of maybe $160,000, $180,000 across 4 years. So when it came time to apply for college, I was applying to all of these colleges. And my college advisor didn't help me with the financial aid form. So I filled it out incorrectly and couldn't go to any of these schools. I wasn't able to go to college immediately. I watched all my friends go off to college. I lost 22 pounds in a month because I sat on the couch and just cried. Again, like you said at the beginning, I love school. I love learning. I love being with my friends in that environment. And I was just depressed about it. And during that summer, the summer camp that I'd attended during my entire childhood, I was hired there as a counselor. And I doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on just really investing in young people and those who look like I do. And right before the first day of school in New York City, my summer camp called me and said, hey, do you want a job working in the Bronx? And anybody who's from New York City knows the Bronx is sort of afraid of Brooklyn and Brooklyn is afraid of the Bronx. So I was like, yeah, sure. But I'd never been to the Bronx. I was nervous about going there. And then I fell in love. And some would say I got trapped, but I stayed there for the next 11 years in the Bronx, really working in community and with community, finding the solutions that are there. And what I realized very quickly is that a lot of nonprofits try to superimpose their solutions on communities when, in fact, the solutions are in the communities already. They just don't have the resources. The people who are most proximate to the problems are the ones who are most proximate to the solutions. They know what they're experiencing. They know how to fix it. They oftentimes just don't have the resources, which is actually my exact view on education and education justice, which is why I work at Our Turn now.
I want to reverse a little bit and talk about that pivotal moment of resiliency, right? We have a tragic moment happen. We lose 22 pounds. We're obviously devastated. We have two choices in this instance. We can either continue to go down this negative spiral, or we can double down at what we're good at. How did you muster the fortitude to say, all right, if I can't do this right now, then I'm going to go double back down on the community which I came from and invest into the people who believed in me?
Yeah, I probably really attribute that ability to having community around me, right? If I was siloed and alone in that moment, I probably would have continued down that negative road. You know, my mom, I would hear my mom crying at night because my mom blamed my inability to go to college on herself.
On her.
Right? She was doing that thing that we do where it's like, if I didn't spend $5 20 years ago, you know, I'd be rich now. Or if I didn't buy that Chinese food last week. But my mom hadn't gone to college at that point. So she didn't know about college savings or even the financial aid form herself, etc. But she would come out from crying in the room and praying, and she'd come out and say, all right, what are you going to do? Let's figure this out. Let's do this. And then I had a gentleman named Mike and a woman, his wife named Sandy, Mike and Sandy Friedman, who were the executive directors of that camp that hired me. And they were sort of my camp Jewish parents. And they were doing the same thing. My entire life, they would say, Kevin, you have so much potential. You can do this. You can be that. And when they realized I wasn't going to college, they sort of said, okay, so what are you going to do? Here's this opportunity. Can you do this? Can you do that? And then many of my friends that I grew up with and that I worked with said the same thing. And they would sort of say, all right, we haven't heard from you in a month, in 3 months, in 6 months. That's not like you, Kev. What are you going to do? What are you doing? And as soon as I got to the Bronx, honestly, because I thought it was going to be a short-term thing. I really was like, hey, I'll work here for a few months, and then I'll go get a job at Guitar Center, or I'll go on tour with Beyonce. Somebody's going to call. But as soon as I got to the Bronx, that community wrapped their arms around you. As soon as they realized I was one of them and fighting for the same things that they were fighting for, they just wrapped their arms around me and said, all right, here's this bacalao, eat this arroz con gandules, eat that, because we exchange currency and food. We don't have a lot of money, but that's how we do. And we're going to support you through and through. Everything that you need, you let us know, and we'll let you know what we need. So it was really community at large wrapping their arms around me.
Man, and this is one of the key elements. It's like sometimes when we don't believe in ourselves, we have a magical gift of having other people believe in us and fill some of those gaps. And it sounds like that's exactly what happened for you, man. I want to transition into some of the impact that you started having in the Bronx, because this story and the numbers and the people that you were engaging with is inspiring. So let's kind of go down that road.
Yeah. So when I got to the Bronx, I was tasked with helping with attendance improvement. Right. They had across New York City what's called AIDP programs, attendance improvement, dropout prevention. And I was in an elementary school that had 64% attendance at the time when I arrived. And they said, all right, you got to improve attendance. There was no manual. There was no sort of training session. I showed up on the first day of school, and the principal, after some tussling, got me in office and said, all right, do your thing. And over the next 2 years, I helped raise that attendance from 64% to 94% attendance. And I mean, I was doing anything and everything to get kids in the seats. My first 2 weeks there, really not understanding what I was supposed to do. I walked through the neighborhood and talked to every person standing outside, every bodega owner, every grandmother sitting on a bench, so that they didn't think that I was ACS, so that they didn't think when I came knocking on their door that I was trying to take their kids away. Right. So I knew the bodega owners by name. I knew the parents in the streets by name. I knew the man that stood on the corner by name, the construction workers. All of them knew me, and I knew them. And they would actually call me Mr. Vacamus. I worked for an organization called Vacamus. And they'd be like, oh, there's Mr. Vacamus coming. And when kids didn't show up to school, I was just going and knocking on their door. And oftentimes schools do reactive work for attendance, right? It's like, oh, you missed school today, so we'll call you at the end of the day. I was monitoring, I had a caseload of about 100 students. I was monitoring them by the hour. If you weren't in school by 9 a.m., school started at 8 a.m., I was going to your house. I was knocking on your door, and I was all right, come on, take a shower, get dressed. I'll stand here. I'll wait. Then their grandparent was feeding me breakfast at that point. Like, okay, thanks for picking them up. Thanks for picking up little Pito. And then I was walking them to school. Or there were test days, and the test has to start at 9:15. And the principal would call me at 8:45 and say, Kevin, we're missing these 5 students. They got to get in by 9:15 to take the citywide test. So I'm driving around the community as the community school bus at that point, picking up kids to make sure that they get to school. And we really got some huge numbers at that point. But after 2 years, the city in its infinite wisdom said, hey, kids don't really cut school at elementary school. They cut it at high school, which is actually not true. Tons of elementary school kids do cut school. And they took away all the funding from elementary schools. So 31 out of 32 staff members in my organization were laid off. My executive director asked me to move to Brooklyn to run our student and temporary housing program. And I refused because I'd fallen in love with the community in the Bronx. And we'd been there even before I arrived. And I said, this is ridiculous for us to up and leave. I didn't understand how nonprofits worked at that point. I thought that we could just decide to stay there. And he hung up the phone on me. A few days later, he called me back and said, what do you want to do? And I realized that a lot of our students were graduating from our elementary school and going to school across the street. And then ending up 5, 10, 20 times worse than when they were in elementary school. They really started to pick up bad habits then. And I did some research and realized that when students don't have a catchment net of services that sort of weans them off that catchment net, then they actually end up worse off than students that never had any support. So I pitched an idea of having a joint after school program that went from third graders through eighth graders that joined together these two schools to really help our students get weaned off of that service and get them into high school. And that program actually turned in over time to when they got to high school, they actually started volunteering to work for that after school program. So we actually had them up to college. And I pitched them on 100 students at $100,000. He said yes. I said, all right, we can start tomorrow. He actually said, no, you need to raise this money. He gave me 3 months that he'd pay my salary and then I'd be fired if I couldn't raise it. I thought that I was actually being set up. I called my mom crying and she said, no, baby, this is your opportunity. You go out there and raise that money. So I started trying to raise money on September 5th of that year. October 5th, I'd raised $135,000 to start our first GLOW program, which existed for the next 9 years, conglomerated about 7,000 students from 16 schools across the tri-state area for 9 years there. And then I went on to Renaissance Youth Center, where I helped to do much of the same work. Their CEO recruited me and said, hey, I saw what you were doing there. Can you do that here? We expanded that to 3,000 students across the city. 2 summer camps where we serviced about 600 students every summer. And we were the loudest camp in New York City. We got called by 311 every day. People were complaining. They were like, why are these kids singing on the train? But all I knew was the woods. So we would take the woods to the hood. I didn't want this to be a stale summer camp experience where we just sort of took the bus every day to trips. I wanted them to feel like they were at sleepaway camp. So we were singing the loudest boom chicka booms that you could hear on the subway at 8 a.m. To the point that we were forcing joy on people. The 311 calls stopped eventually because people were just expecting of this joy every day. And then I moved on to Satellite Academy High School, the #1 transfer high school in New York City, where we helped to raise money to bring kids to study abroad programs across the world. And I'm talking about overaged, undercredited students. Our youngest students were 16 years old. Many of our students had children or were responsible for their younger siblings, and couldn't afford to go, maybe even to the next state, let alone to another country. We were taking kids to South Africa, to Costa Rica, to Brazil. We almost went to Cuba that got canceled a week before, bureaucracy, and doing some real amazing stuff. And then ended up at Change for Kids, where I worked with 13 schools across the city, about 5,500 students, to do this real bespoke community work and figure out what communities need and raise monies to provide that for them.
Do we hear, everybody who's tuning in and listening here today, the impact that one man can have in his community? Every single time I hear you talk about the impact in the lives that you've changed, man, it literally gives me goosebumps. The fact that you've been so intentional about investing into the people who need help most, who often don't have the ability to raise their own hand for help in a time of need, is awe-inspiring. Why did you choose to double down on this work when you are incredibly articulate, incredibly talented? You could have been doing so many other things, Kevin.
It's my mother's fault. My mom was on the front line of HIV and AIDS before it ever had a name. She was working in case management and such during that time. And I watched my mom come home every day, break down in tears because her clients were passing away, and get up every next day and do it again. And I mean, my mom was doing everything. She was feeding the crackheads in the neighborhood for Christmas and Thanksgiving. She was buying double, triple, quadruple the amount of insure that one human being would need because her clients weren't eligible for Medicare and Medicaid just yet so that they could get their weight up. She was giving the clothes off her back. My mom always tells a story about her buying me a new Sherlin coat when I was in the first or second grade and me showing up at school and one of my friends didn't have a coat. And I gave him my coat and she yelled at me about it when I came home and sort of was like, why would you give your coat away? And I was like, he doesn't have a coat because that's all I saw my mom doing. And she looked at me and said, you don't have a coat now. I don't know what we're going to do about it. But she asked me, when I got into youth development and into social impact work, said, how'd you end up here? And I looked at her and I said, where else would I have ended up? This is all I ever saw. I only ever saw you function in the spirit of generosity for mankind. And if we're honest, the word philanthropy, the etymology of that word means for the love of mankind. Mm-hmm. Exactly that. And I ended up in philanthropic work, social impact work, because I followed in the footsteps of my mom.
And your mom has to be incredibly proud of everything that you've accomplished, man. I think it's really important to recognize where we came from and those people who inspired us very early to become the men who we are today. And, there's an interesting, time and space right now we're at in society where being alpha means being tough. Being alpha means being loud. But, I would consider you one of the most alpha people that I've come across because you are leading with a kind heart. You are leaning into people who can't raise their voice, and you're being that voice and that advocate for people who often don't even have an opportunity, man. And that's the true definition of alpha, in my opinion.
Thank you first for that. I'll share something with you, which is not, that we didn't talk about previous to this, and this podcast will probably come out after this news is revealed to the world. Sadly enough, about a week ago, our organization voted to dissolve. So over the next couple of months, our chart is actually going to be dissolving because of the state of fundraising in education justice right now. Now, to your point about really advocating for people who can't advocate for themselves, I had two options when I thought about this decision. I could have, resigned from the role and said, hey, this is someone else's mess. Figure this out. Or option two was to do everything that I could for my staff members, who many of them have never had another job. I've got folks who've been here for 10 years, 8 years, 9 years, who this was their first job and their only job. They haven't been on the front lines of the job market in many, many years. And when I discussed this with my wife, she said, lean into your values and your morals. Like, what do you believe? And I said, I'm here for people. As a leader, I work for the people. I'm working every day for them. So I need to ensure that they have as much of a parachute as possible. So, in discussion with the board, I said, all I care about is making sure that these people can land on their feet to the best of our ability. I don't even care about me. Like, what will happen with me is in God's hands. But let me do what I can to ensure that those folks end up where they can be best left off. And the same thing for our students that we just finished our last fellowship in August. I said, what can we do to make sure that they land best as possible for where they need to go? So it's just affirming for me, for you to say this in such a tumultuous time. And I'm trying not to get emotional, a tumultuous time in our organization's journey. But that's what I believe in. I believe in people, and I believe in advocating for those who maybe don't have a seat at the table to advocate for themselves.
I mean, this is what the definition of being a true leader is. You know what I mean? Like, it's easy to lead in times where everything is going right. It's tough to be a great leader when things are hitting the fan. You know what I mean? And like the test that we are given, I've heard this quote many times, but it's like, God only gives us the test that we are ready to overcome and the things that we can handle. And often when things happen in our life, we're like, why is this happening to me? But on the other side of this transition, of this growth period, there's going to be so many opportunities for you, man. I mean, anybody who tunes into this podcast literally is going to be like, dude, Kevin is a badass. You know what I mean? Like, this guy's doing some amazing stuff. In our previous conversation, we talked a little bit about leadership. And what you're talking about here is a true demonstration of leadership. But we talked about the concept of glass cliffs. I want to talk a little bit about this because you were really passionate about that.
Yeah. Glass cliffs is the notion that women and leaders of color oftentimes get set up to take on leadership roles in organizations when those organizations are in times of crisis or heading into, a negative space, and they're not informed about this or readily informed about it. So it sets them up on this glass cliff that could possibly harm their careers. And, in between the last time we talked and now, I spent a couple of weeks in Bali with my wife, and we did some waterfall canyoning. So we're like rappelling down waterfalls, which has become one of my new favorite activities. And I learned a lesson. And if I ever write a book or something, I'll write one of them about this. The guide in front of you, it's their duty to ensure your safety when you walk into their situation. And I think about that in leadership as well. As I'm about to transition into my next, it is important for me to set up anyone behind me to understand what they're getting into first, and then to know how to safely go about it. So when we were rappelling, the guide would go ahead of us. And then as we were walking, he'd say, put your foot there. Don't put your hand there. Put your rope there. Don't put your rope there. Right. So he'd guide us to the edge of the cliff. And then we had the opportunity to make the choice and the decision on whether or not we'd step off that cliff. Because it was canyoning by election, right? So you could elect to say no, and then you could just walk down the cliff, or you could rappel off. And I think that that's very important in leadership and in business, is that you, one, have the election, the opportunity to elect whether I'm going to hop off this thing or I'm going to avoid it. And that there's someone who's in front of you who's able to say, do go there, don't go there, do put your rope there, don't put your rope there.
I think that as I just mature as a leader, I think about taking care of my team, very similar in the biblical sense of like protecting your flock, right? Knowing where we are going, allowing for them to navigate this path, but being the structure that keeps everybody safe. How did you become such a prolific young leader? Did you have people who you leaned into very early in your career that kind of gave you some of this wisdom, or is this all just coming out of, your mom being an awesome mother and giving you the intuition to be able to navigate these times?
A lot of it is my mom. A lot of it is Mike and Sandy Friedman from Vacamus. Sandy, we'd have 1,500 campers a session, right? So upwards of 3,000 campers a summer. And she knew every kid's name. She knew every kid's parent. I mean, I could describe a kid that I went to camp with when I was a kid, and she'd say, oh, that's Steven, and his mother is so-and-so. And I remember when he did this, and he was from this state. And she was just that dedicated. But also, they would wrap their arms around every staff member. We had staff members from across the world. And they'd learn their little idiosyncrasies and their foibles and what they needed and what ticked them off. And they taught me how to lead from the heart first. And then in my career, I met a gentleman named Alan Van Capel, who's now the CEO of the Friends of the High Line in New York City. And I met him when he was the CEO of Educational Alliance. And he taught me about values-based leadership. And he said, you have two responsibilities as a leader, and then as a nonprofit leader, you have a third. So as a nonprofit, your responsibility obviously is to keep the ship moving. You have to fundraise, you have to inspire. But as a leader, you have two responsibilities. One is to the people who work with you. You need to engender them with such confidence in their own ability first, and then in your ability to lead them, that they'd run into a burning building with you or for you. And then secondly, you need to know that your responsibility is to build them to be the best versions of themselves, which oftentimes means that they will leave you. Far best that they can be for them in their own organizations, in their own work, where he sort of said, hey, build them to be the best that they can be. And that oftentimes means that they will leave you. And that shifted my mind for me. I have recommended so many staff members who were working for me at that moment for higher positions, for better positions. Recruiters reach out to me for stuff for me. And I say, no, but I have the perfect person for you. And many of my staff members don't even know that I ever recommended them, and they'll come to me, as many staff members do when they leave, and they're sad. They're like, man, I got this new opportunity. I'm so sorry for leaving. And I'm always gracious about it. But in the back of my mind, I'm cheering. That's another win for us, for the global team, because they're moving on to bigger, better, and best for them.
There's an amazing author. His name is Kevin Kelly, and in one of his recent books, he says, "You lead by letting others know what you expect of them, which may often exceed what they expect of themselves. Provide them a reputation which they can live up to."
Yeah, exactly that. I couldn't have said it better. My namesake, Kevin.
I mean, this is exactly, the thing that I think is really powerful about this conversation is you come from a place of such deep confidence and such gracious willingness to invest into others that you have ultimate trust in yourself. We have conversations with leaders all the time where often our ego, right, gets in the way of saying, I'm going to train people so good that they can leave, but treat them so good that they won't. That is a confidence that comes with an abundance mindset. Do you feel like you kind of tap into that consistently?
Absolutely. Not to get overly biblical or spiritual, but I really live and exist in this space and place that believes that me being able to live, me being able to lead is all a gift and a privilege, right? And none of this belongs to me, like inherently belongs to me, right? It belongs to God, which is outside of me. And as a result of that, I'm just a steward. I'm just here trying to do the right things with the resources that I have and the time that I have. So I need to steward all of that correctly. I think I live in this abundance sort of mindset because I lived the first couple of years of my life in a poverty mindset, right? Believing like, oh man, we don't have what's on TV. We don't have enough. But back to my mother, she didn't live in that mindset. My mom did everything that she could to never say no. I don't remember my mom ever saying no when I was a kid. She didn't always say yes, but we joke about it, my siblings and I. My mom's favorite line was, I'll see. And I'll see, like 93% of the time, meant yes. But it gave us just enough hope to be able to go on. Hey, can we get this new Game Boy? I'll see. And that was enough. That was enough for us to believe and to have that faith that it's going to happen. Could we go out to Junior's for my birthday? I'll see. That was enough. I could run on for a month on that I'll see. And I just live in that same space where I just believe that in my heart and in my life that I'm always functioning in an I'll see spirit.
I've been messing around with this framework on the podcast, and I want to get your opinion on it. So part of my personal brand, and I feel like I haven't been living up to the fullest potential of it when I sit across from amazing people like you, is I'm always incredibly optimistic, right? I've been so optimistic that people in the past have called me toxically positive. And so what I've tried to do is put language around this so people who don't understand that the world that we see in front of us is malleable. When we put trust and we put hope and we put compassion into the future, things happen. And so what I've tried to do is put a framework together called practical optimism. Practical optimism is something that you can deploy when things aren't going your way, but you have a confidence of I'll see what happens in the future and being able to lean into that sense of optimism. What do you think about that practical optimism framework compared to being pessimistic in this world?
I think it's very, very necessary. There's I forget the name of the gentleman who the principle is about. But there's a principle that basically says, in leadership, you have to hold both truths at the same time. That you have to have faith and belief that you can win, while also saying the odds are stacked against us, or like we lost the last battle, or what have you. And those two things have to exist at the same time. And as a leader, you have to be able to hold that. And I think that's exactly what practical optimism is. Right? Because far too many people look at the day-to-day scenario and say, man, here are all the reasons why this won't work or can't work or shouldn't work. Right? But if you live in this place of optimism, practical optimism, you can exist with the reasons that maybe it couldn't or shouldn't work. But you can also say, I have the hope, the faith, the belief in myself, my team, my people, in the vision, et cetera, that we'll get there. Like the other night, I had the privilege of playing keyboards with Imagine Dragons at the Tyler Robinson Foundation Gala, which is for pediatric cancer patients. And I was so inspired being there because of these young people who otherwise could have said, I have pediatric cancer. They said, I'm not going to make it. So why be joyful? Why be happy? Why run around? Why laugh, giggle, etc., etc.? But each one of these kids was amazingly and awe-inspiringly just a kid. They were just hopeful. They were just joyful. They were just lively enough to just be a kid. And I said, that is the way that we are purposed to live. That irregardless of what we are faced with on a day-to-day basis, there's still joy, there's still hope, there's still faith, and we need to pursue that. Everything else is going to work out the way it's going to work out, but pursue that.
Kevin, if you could go back to that young kid who was sitting on the couch, who just got the worst news of his life at that point in time, right? And you could give him advice for how he was going to navigate the future, what would you say to him?
I'd probably tell him the sun is always going to come out. The sun always rises. Always rises. You know, not to be cliche with Annie, the sun will come out tomorrow, but storms are going to happen. But the sun always comes out. It always rises. It may take a day. It may take 2 days, but the sun always rises. And I think it's really easy in that moment. And for me, it was really easy to be like doom and gloom. My life is over. The world has crashed. You know, they said, if you go to college, you can be whatever. But if you don't go to college, you'll be nothing. Right. To those two extremes. And to be able to sit down with him and say, hey, I see you. I hear you. I understand what you're going through. But I promise you, the sun is going to rise again.
You know, one of the traditions we have as we end our episode here is our previous guest wanted to ask you a question. And their question was, did your goals ever shift in the priorities of life or the priorities of your career along this journey?
Absolutely. I think my short-term goals shifted, but never my big, hairy, audacious goal. Very early on at the Center for Creative Leadership, someone asked me, what's your life mission? And I had no clue. And it worked us through, a couple of days of determining that. And my life mission is to get the best out of people, or to produce. I actually use the word produce, to produce the best in and out of people for the betterment of them. Right. And that speaks to all areas of my life, right? Whether that's nonprofit work or in music by trade, though I get to play keyboard sometimes, I'm a music producer. And not in the sense that I want to be in a video dancing around and such. I want to get the best work out of the artist that I'm working with and craft the painting that they already have in their mind. So that's another podcast for another day, but far too many producers believe that their job is to be the artist. I don't want to be. I want to get the art out of the artist. But that's the same thing for anyone I'm coaching, any young person I'm working with, etc. So yeah, short-term goals definitely shifted. I got married and this happened, or I lost that job or gained that job or what have you. But the big, hairy, audacious goal has remained the same.
I feel like that's a beautiful place for us to end today's conversation. Kevin, thank you from the bottom of my heart for being on the podcast, man. It means the world to me.
Thank you.